Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing our March book to the table. It's written by Harsha Walia, and it's called Border and Rule: Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. Ooh. It was published by Haymarket Books back in 2021. And Harsha talks about the purpose of this book in the introduction when she says that it is, quote, a modest endeavor to more deeply interrogate the formation and function of borders as a spatial and material power structure. Borders are an ordering regime, both assembling and assembled through racial capitalist accumulation and colonial relations. By looking at various jurisdictions around the world, I also intend to break through methodological nationalism, specifically U.S. exceptionalism, and unearth transnational trends. Many on the left believe the cruelties of U.S. immigration policy are homegrown and then exported, when, in fact, most repressive technologies of border rule are perfected elsewhere. And I pull this particular quote out because it does such a great job of laying out the premise of the book and how much Harsha actually accomplishes over the course of a couple hundred pages. And there's a lot in this book about the U.S., our collective history of violence, and a history of violence and border control across Canada, Europe, Australia, West Asia, and the right-wing nationalism that arises alongside the context of establishing and enforcing borders. And there's a foreword by Robin D.G. Kelley that was great, and an afterword by Nick Estes, which was also great.
Yes.
But that's enough for my introduction.
Yeah.
I could probably go on, but where do you want to start?
No, I'm sure you could, because there's so much in this book, as you say, and that was a really great piece of the introduction to pull, because I think it does do a great job of encapsulating all the things that she talks about in this book, in this incredible book. She does so much in these couple hundred pages, as you say, and it's such a thorough examination of borders, right? And everything surrounding that. And the idea of borders being assembled through racist capitalist accumulation and colonial relations and U.S. exceptionalist policies is definitely a huge focus of this book. But she also says that she unearths transnational trends. And there's so much that she brings to the table and analyzes related to that idea of transnational trends throughout the book. There's the legality and illegality issues surrounding migration. There's the role of climate change in global migration and displacement. There's the impact of state violence and war on the need to leave. There's the role of authoritarianism and fascism and right-wing nationalism and the impact of those things on people's lives and total societies. There's the pretext of the pandemic, right? And really sort of various health crises that create the conditions for migration and just so much more that she addresses in this book. And on top of all of that, or I should say simultaneously, Harsha also dives into how race and class and gender are considerable factors and impact the experience of migrants and refugees across the globe, and what that looks like in the context of global migration and especially labor migration. And so, there's so much we could talk about from this book. It really was such a powerful book. And to me, with sort of all that context, this is a book about humanity. She does everything we've mentioned here while keeping the experience of migrants and refugees and how they are displaced and criminalized and exploited and removed and assaulted and even killed as part of border formation policies, global migration politics. She does all of that and keeps those human beings at the forefront of her analysis. And I think that was, of course, 100% intentional and a way to call this crisis of humanity to our attention.
Yeah, I think that, as you said, it's a crisis of humanity, and the way that nationalism operates, as we've talked about a lot here, undercuts that basic decency of understanding who one another are.
Yes.
The way that capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism emphasizes us as individuals separate from one another that's another piece. This is the national manifestation of that kind of individuality. Right?
Yes.
And so she points that out throughout the text, I think.
Yeah.
And
also talks about the internationalist perspective of that as well. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the critique of the legal framework that she has around migration, because the argument, at least in the US, is always about how people should come here the right way and blah, 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 but never with an acknowledgement of what that means or how that process is constructed. And Harsha talks about this in chapter 4, which is called Bordering Regimes. She says, quote, "Migrant illegality is not an objective fact. People become illegalized, are made illegal because of state restrictions on entering or remaining without legal authorization. Pathways to becoming a legal permanent resident are shrinking around the world, with visa entry impositions, asylum claim rejections, removal of citizenship as a birthright, limits on family reunification, and stripping of residency for dubious security and criminal offenses," which she has some really pointed examples of those dubious security and criminal offenses in the book, which were horrifying.
Yeah.
All of this highlights the deliberate obfuscation of this process.
Yeah.
And she drives this point home further when she says a little later, quote, "The law constructs illegality while racism constructs the illegal. The law is a container for how the process works, but the law is operating as a bordering agent for white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. These are necropolitical decisions to identify who is welcome and who is not welcome.
Yes.
And it's frequently dressed up in the guise of some kind of narrative about security, which is fabricated or at least manipulated and blown out of proportion.
Right.
And ultimately, these decisions are based on a structure of racial purity, of maintaining a racial order in a country so that it can remain the same and can remain controllable in that sameness.
There it is. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so spot on. And I'm with you. I really appreciated her analysis around how the law and politics and state governments, play such a huge role in all of this, and the way that the state gets to apply this issue to these people, if you will, without acknowledging the larger systemic issues and conditions at play, and how that's all by design, how it was created by the state in the first place. So yeah, those are really great points. I want to talk about something I'm going to take us back to chapter 1, which was titled Historic Entanglements of U.S. Border Formation. She offers some really great history and analysis around the formation of the U.S.-Mexico border and just the tremendous impact of that border on establishing the United States as exactly what it is, what it has always been, and what it continues to be, which, and these are her words, is, quote, "a settler, slaveholding, expansionist, and exclusionary state." And I was like, yes, that. And so she says this as a way to summarize what's important to keep in mind about all of this. Quote, "Most mainstream analyses of U.S. immigration ignore this history of border and state formation, even as it continues to animate U.S. imperial ambitions and racial capitalist rule." Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz argues that the liberal narrative of a nation of immigrants is grossly inaccurate, erasing the violence of conquests and borders upon Mexican, indigenous, Black, and colonized communities to produce the sanitized myth of a melting pot. In contrast to the inaccurate framing, "we are a nation of immigrants," the more subversive chant, "we did not cross the border crossed us," destabilizes the southern border by interrogating the assumption of migrant on seized land and exposing the hypocrisy of colonizers calling people illegals. Subjugated communities, particularly indigenous and Black, importantly, not mutually exclusive, are often folded into the liberal narrative of racial minorities. Further, indigenous, decolonial, and Black abolition struggles are largely seen as disconnected from the immigrant rights movement, except in identifying shared struggles against racism. However, the war on migrants does not exist separate from or simply parallel to anti-indigenous and anti-Black violence. Early U.S. bordering practices were, in fact, conceived of as a method of eliminating indigenous people and controlling Black people, and U.S. border imperialism is structurally bound up in the genocides. And there's so much to take from all of that excerpt there. In this moment, I'm particularly drawn to the idea of what we should keep in mind as we navigate our collective fights and our movements for social justice, and the ways in which our struggles are 100% connected, just like our liberation is, to one another.
Yeah, and it reminds me why we talk about liberation here instead of justice, because justice is a framework that is held in a colonial state.
Yes.
And so that's one of the reasons why we talk about liberation, is because we want to recognize that justice is inadequate.
Yeah, it's limiting.
In the context of a settler state. I forget the other very apt adjectives that you quoted a minute ago. But as a settler state, justice is going to be incomplete.
Yes. It's
no
not
matter
gonna fit
what.
the bill. Absolutely. Not for all of us. Yeah.
Liberation is what we have to strive for, which is, I appreciate you ending your part there with liberation. I think that's what we're striving for. That's what we want to see.
That's what we need. Absolutely.
Yeah. So chapter 11, not the bankruptcy, but maybe sort of, because it's about the inherent bankruptcy of nationalism. It's called Refusing Reactionary Nationalisms.
Right.
There was a lot of great analysis in here about how nationalism has become a sort of invisible accepted norm in the discussions about migration and immigration. We accept that the border exists and that it should, which cedes power and argument to the right-wing authoritarians who take advantage of the economic crises that they create through their policies.
Yes.
And then Harsha talks about how this works in a few ways. First, she says, quote, "The crisis of neoliberalism for working people, debt, wage stagnation, rising cost of living, and downward mobility is weaponized by far-right forces who position themselves as anti-establishment. But far-right leaders prescribe a messianic rescue, not actual redistribution from the upheavals of neoliberalism." We've talked about this on the show before, but the economic decline over the last several decades for regular working people, and maybe even so-called upper middle class people, is leveraged by people like Trump to stoke our fears of continued economic decline and sell us on the solutions that people like him provide.
Right.
Which is actually just stripping the U.S. for parts, which we can see with the news this week that the post office might not make it to 2028.
Yes. I was just talking about that today.
And we can see this in other places too that are connected to our labor. Harsha says, quote, "One of the most pernicious forms of white supremacy on the left today is the animation of the working class along nationalist lines. Like appeals to whiteness, the conditioning of class through citizenship is not simply a social identity. It is imbued with economic value as a form of property. Calls on citizens to protect our jobs puts working class movements on a path away from collective ownership of the means of production and instead towards an ambiguous sense of ownership of the nation state."
Ooh, that part.
Yeah, right? We believe we need to advocate for ourselves and our jobs, and that makes sense to some degree. I get it, but it's short-sighted because, as Harsha says here, it shifts the focus from collective ownership of labor itself, of the means of production, to feeling like you belong somewhere.
Right.
It flattens it to something seductive. It's a defanging of a movement because it's tied into a larger sense of pride of place rather than collectively owning the work, or at least having a larger sense of control of your workplace through something like a union.
Yeah.
And it specifically means that the position we hold can be undermined because the fear of the other and the fear of loss of what little we do have and what little crumbs that they let us take from the table and the manufactured sense of precarity that comes with all of that can be used to erode the demands of labor, of workers, of everyday people.
Yeah, that is brilliant. There's so much in this book around, as I said at the top, analysis around race, class, and gender. And the class stuff is really such a huge takeaway from this book, I think. And I think this also connects to what you said at the beginning about, our liberation being tied to one another. And what they try to do is make us see ourselves as individuals fighting for that, little piece of our own and, forget the others, and especially forget the others who don't look like you and are stealing our job and all of that nonsense when there is enough for all of us.
Yeah, and it ties back into that concept of the nationalism, which she's talking about through this quote, is Well, if I believe that we deserve what we have, it creates that border,
Yeah.
where we see ourselves as separate from labor or from workers or from regular people in another country who are also demanding similar things, maybe from the same transnational conglomerate.
Hey, maybe. Absolutely. No, I love that. One of the things that's kind of connected to that, I was really fascinated by Harsha's work in this book to highlight and analyze labor migration and the conditions that so many migrant and refugee workers experience really around the globe. And the push and pull of liberal ideas of specifically temporary labor migration versus more conservative calls for complete migrant exclusion and everything surrounding all of that. One of the things that stood out to me from chapter 7, which is titled Temporary Labor Migration and the New Braceros, was Harsha's work to highlight the various forms of structural power that control the lives of temporary migrant workers. And I was really fascinated by, there are these 5 common features. And so I just want to kind of name them and talk a little bit about them. So first, migrant worker programs are state-sanctioned programs of indentured work that can be traced all the way back to the British Empire. And what that means is that employment is a requirement of migration, and employers control these people's lives in so many ways. Second, migrant worker programs are formed of legalized segregation, meaning migrants can live and work among citizens, but are always considered outsiders by the state. And that has lots of manifestations. Third, migrant worker programs are a form of neoliberal insourcing, which ultimately boils down to them being subjected to lower wages, more intense disciplinary action if things go wrong, and ultimately sees them as expendable. Fourth, migrant worker programs represent a distinct mode of racialization, which is all about the idea that migrant workers are further subjected to racial discrimination and also gender violence, given their status. And last but certainly not least, Harsha highlights how migrant worker programs are a carceral regime. And this is the idea that these programs are, in effect, an extension of the carceral system. And so I read all of those and the examples that she provided, and I just thought how terrible all of this is, right?
Yeah.
How we've got millions of people laboring under these kinds of conditions around the world. And, just thinking back to my point about humanity, we're talking about people wanting more for themselves, wanting more for their families, wanting better lives for their families. But this is the cost of that. To me, and in so many places throughout the book, it felt sickening to sort of read about this and understand what's happening here and how people are being subjected to this and treated this way, particularly by states and countries and corporations that have the means to do so much better.
Yeah. And I think as you read those points again,
Yeah.
and I remember this and reading this in the book, and
Yeah.
it's standing out to me as well. But as you read them again, I thought if you changed a few words in this, you would be describing enslavement in this country.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you change sort of the context of how people are stolen and brought here, right? The change the context of migration.
Yeah.
And again, what are the choices that people make to migrate into a place that loudly says we don't want you here?
Right.
And I think there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of parallels
There are.
in those 5 particular pieces of what temporary migrant work looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. To slavery. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
How does this apply to our day-to-day lives and work? Harsha closes this book with this quote: "Even as bordering practices fragment internationalist solidarities and exert seemingly totalizing power over who migrates and under which conditions, the mere existence of autonomous illegal migration, an expression of revolt, redistribution, and reparation, defies attempts to control it. This is our starkest reminder that man-made borders shall never fully thwart human movements compelled by the upheavals of our era. This book, Against Borders, is ultimately a book about world-making as a process of home-making." And I close with the prophetic words of Toni Morrison: "In this new space, one can imagine safety without walls, can iterate difference that is prized but unprivileged, and can conceive of a third, if you will pardon the expression, world, already made for me, both snug and wide open, with a doorway never needing to be closed. Home. The freedom to stay and the freedom to move are revolutionary corollaries, refusing imperial bordered sovereignties, with home as our shared horizon. Our concept of home is important.
Yes.
And that concept has been narrowed consistently. We're told who belongs and who doesn't. We're told who can come and who can't. We're told that this is our best choice, is to stay.
Mm-hmm.
A world without borders is one where the people are all home with one another. And it's the people.
Yeah.
I think it's a world that allows us to see one another as siblings rather than separate groups of people. It's one that allows for solidarity to grow and for the labor unions we were talking about earlier to see common cause with one another across oceans, across seas. And for us to see that where the differences lie are not with the people who are working every day to bring home a check, to put food on the table and a roof over your head. The differences lay with the people who are making decisions on how those things work for the rest of us.
Yes.
And when we can see those things and we can see one another as siblings, that's why borders exist, is another way to reinforce those that separateness, those differences.
Yeah.
So that we see each other as different and we don't see the ways that all the things we have in common.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your application?
That's beautiful. Any mention and use of Toni Morrison's words, I was like, yep, that's a great way to close the book.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your application there and your analysis of her final words of this book. My application comes from the afterword of this great book. And I simply want to share how Nick Estes opens it, because I kid you not, I read it and I had to put my Kindle down because it was so powerful. To me, he did such a beautiful job not mincing words to name so much of what's wrong with our society and our world. Certainly not everything that's wrong, but a lot of it. So he says, quote, "A planet torn asunder from centuries of pillaging and theft is on the brink of collapse. Rising temperatures and sea levels correlate with growing inequality and violence. The unnatural divisions within humanity sharpen. Wealth accumulates into the hands of 8 white men who own half the world's social wealth as of 2017. The world's golf courses, a symbol of affluence, consume enough water to keep 4.7 billion people on the planet hydrated, yet large portions of humanity live without access to clean drinking water. The enforced scarcity of precious resources necessary for life is not a deviation. It is the desired outcome of global capitalism. The lethal inefficiency of neoliberalism to fulfill the needs of the vast majority of people, however, has created a political vacuum, and some find answers in neo-fascism and authoritarianism. The imagination of a world otherwise appears to be in short supply. Those who live in zones of suffering and war are separated from those who live with a dangerous illusion of peace, while actively denying that their countries not only produce misery, but stand in the way of humanity's freedom. Wealth is allowed to flow to the centers of global capital, but never outward. The mobility of capital never applies to the wretched of the earth, who are forced to traverse deadly waters and land passages across borders, not of their own making, and are unwelcome in countries that may have destroyed theirs. Only punishment awaits them. Their mobility is made criminal, their existence made illegal. While it is framed as a migrant or refugee crisis, it is really a crisis of humanity, the failure of the current system to offer any real alternatives other than the demonization of the other. And I mean, just wow. I don't know that I have much to add to Nick's beautiful words there, but I will say that reading that and processing it, just makes it clear to me that it is imperative that we not only imagine a better world and the world we all need, but we have to fight like hell for it. And I think, it's connected to everything you said in your application about seeing each other as brothers and sisters and family and people, and that these borders should not separate us. We are in this thing together.
Yeah, because it's ultimately the only place we all have to live.
Yeah, for however long we have left.
Yeah, so we have to.
Yeah.
We have to do things differently.
Absolutely.
And that I remember this opening the afterward as well, but I forgot about the golf course
Yeah.
statistic about consuming enough water to keep 4.7 billion people on the planet hydrated.
Yeah.
That's mind-boggling.
It really is.
And you know what it does? It really clarifies my hatred of golf courses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I knew this deep down.
Yeah.
But now I've got numbers to back it up.
There you go. Justified.
Yeah.
I love it.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversations today? Harsha wrote another book called Undoing Border Imperialism, which was published by AK Press back in 2013. The description of the book says it reformulates immigrant rights movements within a transnational analysis of capitalism, labor exploitation, settler colonialism, state building, and racialized empire, and provides the alternative conceptual frameworks of border imperialism and decolonization, which sounds like a really great foundation for the concepts in this book.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to get back to that at some point and also read other things that Harsha Walia is working on wherever we can find those.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll co-sign that homework. It would be great to, as you say, continue to learn from her. And so reading her previous book would be great. My other thought for homework is just a little basic. I just want to revisit this book that we read for today and spend more time with it. I was definitely a little bit rushed trying to finish this book. I just finished it yesterday so that I could be prepared for our conversation today. But there are so many incredible lessons from history in this book, and Harsha's analysis of the impact of borders and violence and globalization on so much of our society is just too good not to spend more time with it.
Yeah.
So I want to pick this book back up and read some more from it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great homework. It's always good to revisit things, and sometimes that should be the homework in my mind for myself, is to go back and reread things.
Yeah,
because you always catch more stuff.
Absolutely.
But that never comes to my mind. So good on you.
There you go.
For bringing that.
There you go.
All right, well, that's it for our discussion of Border and Rule, a really incredible book that is 5 years old, but still very, very relevant to what's happening today.
Yes.
And Damien, you're up next time.
Yeah.
What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Well, my friend, I'm very excited to bring a piece from the newest edition of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about. They just released their 10th issue a few weeks ago, and I have been looking forward to cracking it open metaphorically because it's, on the internet.
It's digital.
It's digital. But the piece we're going to read is called White Supremacy in Donald Trump's White House. It was written
What?
What? It's there. It was written by the one and only Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and I'll be honest, Keeanga is a huge reason why I chose this particular piece. I think we both really appreciate her writing style, her wisdom, her worldview, the way she also doesn't mince her words. And so, yeah, that's why I chose this one. The tagline of this piece reads, quote, "The administration's crude vilification of anti-discrimination policies is meant to erase the radical promise of the Black freedom struggle." So, yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this one and talking about it with you next time.
Yeah, me too. I've been getting emails from Hammer and Hope about release parties that they've had and different things. So I've been looking forward to the 10th issue. And so glad we get to metaphorically crack it open, as you say.
And 10th issue. Isn't that incredible? Good on them.
All right, and with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.